add them all up, and I'd figure I was owed about all the gold we could carry out of these mountains.
They rode into the mountains one last time, two aging lawmen, a bag of gold, and a director nobody trusted. Ride the High Country wasn't supposed to matter. It was a throwaway Western with a tiny budget and stars Hollywood had forgotten. But what happened on that mountain changed everything. The studio buried it. The leads retired. And one scene, they shot it with real bullets flying past the actors' heads. These are 20 weird facts about Ride the High Country. And the bonus? The film almost had a completely different ending that would have destroyed its legacy. Mount up. This trail gets rough. Sam Peckinpah didn't want to make a Western. Not another one. He'd just come off The Deadly Companions, a troubled shoot that left him exhausted, bitter, and creatively drained. The production had been a nightmare. Constant interference from producers who didn't trust him, actors who ignored his direction, a final cut that barely resembled what he'd envisioned. When producer Richard Lyons approached him with a script about two aging lawmen escorting gold through the mountains, Peckinpah almost said no immediately. He was tired of cowboys, tired of horses, tired of dust and blood, and the same old stories Hollywood kept recycling. The Western genre felt exhausted to him, played out, with nothing new left to say. Television had flooded the market with cheap shoot-'em-ups. Audiences were getting bored, and Peckinpah felt trapped in a dying format. But Lyons was persistent. He kept calling, kept insisting this script was different. So Peckinpah finally agreed to read it, more to get Lyons off his back than out of any real interest. But then he read the script, really read it, alone in his office late at night with a bottle of whiskey, and something clicked deep inside him. This wasn't another Western about heroes and villains. It was a eulogy, a farewell to men who'd outlived their time, wandering through a world that no longer wanted them or their outdated codes of honor. Peckinpah saw himself in those characters, saw his own struggles reflected in their journey. A director fighting to stay relevant in a changing Hollywood that increasingly valued spectacle over substance. So he took the job, not because he loved Westerns, but because he understood what it felt like to be left behind, and that understanding soaked into every frame. Number 2. MGM gave Peckinpah the job on one condition: make it fast and make it cheap. The budget was microscopic, just over $800,000, pocket change even by 1962 standards, when epics were costing millions. They had exactly 26 days to shoot the entire film, from the opening scenes in town to the final shootout in the mining camp. No second chances, no reshoots, no safety net, no room for artistic temperament. The schedule was absolutely brutal. Peckinpah would wake before dawn, sketch out scenes in notebooks, then spend breakfast adjusting his plans based on weather reports. On set, he'd draw angles in the dirt between takes, adjusting compositions, cutting dialogue on the fly, finding shortcuts that wouldn't compromise his vision. They filmed in the high Sierras during late fall when the weather was unpredictable and getting worse. The light was fading faster each day as winter approached. Some mornings they'd arrive at a location to find it shrouded in fog. Some days they'd lose precious hours to sudden rainstorms that swept down without warning. Other days the sun would disappear behind the mountains at 3 in the afternoon before they'd finished a crucial sequence. The crew worked 12, sometimes 14-hour days. Equipment kept malfunctioning in the cold. Actors shivered between takes, but Peckinpah never complained. He thrived under pressure. The constraints didn't limit him. They sharpened him, forced him to trust his instincts. And what could have been just another disposable B-Western became something haunting and beautiful, not in spite of the limitations, but because of them. Speed forced instinct, and instinct, it turned out, was exactly what the film needed.
But miles apart when tempers blazed.
You always fancy.
Number 3. Randolph Scott was supposed to retire. By 1962, he'd made over 100 films, the vast majority of them Westerns, and his body was screaming at him to stop. He was 64 years old. Decades of riding horses, taking falls, doing his own stunts, it had all caught up with him. His joints ached every morning. His back gave him constant trouble. The long days in the saddle, once effortless, had become genuinely painful. Close friends said he was ready to walk away from Hollywood completely, maybe buy a ranch somewhere quiet, disappear into peaceful anonymity. He'd earned it. Nobody could say he hadn't given everything to the genre. But when his agent sent him the script for Ride the High Country, something stopped him from immediately saying no. He read it once, then read it again the next morning. The character of Gil Westrom, a former lawman with a legendary reputation now reduced to performing in Wild West shows and carnival acts, hit too close to home. Scott saw the parallel. An aging star watching Hollywood move on without him, scrambling for relevance, performing cheap tricks for audiences who barely remembered who he used to be. It wasn't just a character, it was a mirror. He called the producers himself and said yes, not because he needed the money, but because he needed to play this role. One last ride, one final performance that meant something beyond another paycheck. And when cameras rolled, Scott didn't just act, he bled. Every line carried the weight of a career ending, a life closing. Gil Westrom's quiet desperation, his compromised dignity, his hunger for one last meaningful score, it all came from someplace real. And after filming wrapped, Scott never made another movie. He rode off into the sunset for real. Number 4. Joel McCrea wasn't supposed to be in the film at all. Peckinpah wanted him desperately from the beginning, could see him as Steve Judd in his mind, but McCrea had already turned down the role twice without even meeting. He was semi-retired at 56, happy on his sprawling ranch, genuinely done with the grind and politics of filmmaking. He'd made his money, proven himself, and now he wanted peace. But Peckinpah wouldn't give up. He drove to McCrea's ranch unannounced one afternoon, script in hand, determined to make his pitch face-to-face. Not in an office, not over the phone. In the man's own home, where he couldn't hide behind agents. McCrea was surprised but gracious, invited Peckinpah in for coffee. They sat on the porch, and Peckinpah made his case. He told McCrea this wasn't just another Western about gunfights and gold. It was about honor in a dishonorable world, about doing the right thing when nobody's watching, about aging men trying to hold onto their dignity in their final years. The themes resonated, but McCrea still hesitated. Then he asked one question. Who's playing Gil? Peckinpah said Randolph Scott. McCrea's entire face changed. Scott was a close friend, a fellow Westerner who'd walked the same hard roads for decades. They'd been talking for years about finding one last project together. The chance to work together one last time, that sealed it. McCrea said yes, and just like Scott, he never acted in another theatrical film. They rode into the sunset together, on screen and off. Number 5. The opening scene almost didn't happen the way Peckinpah envisioned it. He wanted to establish Steve Judd's fall from grace immediately. Show him working as a hired guard for a bank, riding alone through town past a cheap carnival, a shadow of his former self. But MGM executives wanted action. They wanted gunfire, chases, explosions, something to grab audiences by the throat in the first 5 minutes. That was the formula. That's what sold tickets. Peckinpah refused point blank. He told them with barely controlled anger that the quiet humiliation of an aging lawman was infinitely more powerful than any shootout. The studio pushed back hard. They held meetings without him. They threatened to recut the opening themselves, to impose their vision. But Peckinpah had an ace. He'd already shot it his way. And when the dailies came back, when executives watched McCrea ride slowly through that town, past the carnival with its fake Wild West show mocking everything he'd lived for, even they had to admit it worked. That slow, almost painful introduction, McCrea's face registering every slight, riding through a world that barely noticed him, it set the tone for everything that followed. No explosions, no spectacle, no pandering, just a man trying to hold his head high in a world that had forgotten him. And that restraint, that confidence in silence over action, became Peckinpah's signature in all his later work. Number 6. Mariette Hartley was only 21 years old when she was cast as Elsa Knudsen, the young woman caught between innocence and corruption. It was her first major film role, and she was absolutely terrified. The cast was full of living legends, McCrea and Scott, men who'd defined the Western genre. veteran character actors like Edgar Buchanan who'd been working since the silent era. She felt like an imposter, certain she'd be exposed and fired at any moment. On her first day of filming, she flubbed the same line 3 times in a row. Her mouth went dry. Her hands shook. She was sure Peckinpah would fire her on the spot, make an example of her, but instead, he did something unexpected. He called cut, walked over calmly, and pulled her aside, away from the crew, speaking quietly. And he said something she never forgot. "You're not here to be perfect. You're here to be real." He told her Elsa was supposed to be uncertain, conflicted, searching for identity. So if she felt scared, use it. Let the fear live in the performance. Don't fight it, channel it. Hartley took a deep breath, centered herself, went back, and nailed the take. From that moment on, she stopped trying to impress anyone and started trusting her instincts. And Peckinpah never yelled at her again. He gave her space to discover the character. And what she found was one of the most quietly powerful female performances in any Peckinpah film. Elsa wasn't a stereotype, she was real. Number 7. The Hammond brothers were supposed to be comic relief in early drafts. In the original script, they were bumbling villains, almost cartoonish in their incompetence. But Peckinpah absolutely hated that. He told the writers to make them dangerous, unpredictable, men who'd laugh while they hurt you, who'd smile while doing terrible things. Warren Oates and John Anderson, who played the brothers, immediately understood and leaned into the madness. They improvised disturbing bits of cruelty, small gestures that made the characters feel unhinged. In one scene, Oates was supposed to simply threaten Elsa. Instead, on impulse, he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks. It hurt. Hartley didn't break character. She let the real fear show on her face. Peckinpah loved it. He kept the take and told the actors to keep pushing. By the end of filming, the Hammond brothers had transformed from jokes into genuine menace. They became a dark mirror to Judd and Westrom, showing what men become without codes, without honor, without limits. And that contrast, civilized men versus savages, became the heart of the film's conflict. The wedding scene was filmed in a real mountain church, and the local congregation was furious. The sequence where Elsa is forced into a grotesque marriage ceremony with one of the Hammond brothers was controversial even on paper. When Peckinpah's crew arrived at a small church, the minister took one look at the script and flatly refused to participate. He said the scene mocked the sanctity of marriage. Peckinpah tried to explain it was satire, commentary on hypocrisy, but the minister wouldn't budge, so they had to hire an actor to play the drunk preacher, a man who sells the ceremony for money. But even that wasn't enough. Some locals showed up to protest the shoot. They stood outside with signs, calling the film blasphemous. Peckinpah ignored them completely. He filmed the scene exactly as written, deliberately slow and uncomfortable and deeply unsettling. And when it played in theaters, audiences squirmed in their seats, which was the point. The wedding wasn't supposed to be funny. It was supposed to hurt, to make viewers confront ugliness, and it did. Number 9. The final shootout almost killed someone, not through stunt work, through carelessness. The climactic gunfight in the mining camp was shot with practical effects, real squibs taped to actors' bodies, real blanks fired from real guns, and very little margin for error. During one take, a squib detonated early, a full second before it was supposed to, sending debris flying toward Warren Oates' face. He ducked instinctively. The crew froze in horror. If the explosion had gone off 1 second later, Oates could have been seriously injured, possibly blinded. They immediately shut down production for over an hour to inspect every remaining charge. Peckinpah was furious, not at the crew but at himself for pushing so hard. He'd been so focused on getting the sequence perfect that he'd overlooked basic safety. After that scare, he forced himself to slow down, just a little, but enough, because no film was worth dying for. Everyone knew it. The shootout, when it finally came together, was brutal and effective, but every frame carried the weight of what almost happened.
Draw, you damn...
Number 10. Joel McCrea did all his own stunts, every single one. At 56 years old, he refused a double. When Steve Judd had to mount a running horse at full gallop, McCrea did it himself. When he had to run through rocky terrain, no hesitation. Peckinpah kept offering him a stunt coordinator, someone younger, someone safer. McCrea waved him off every time with a smile. He'd been riding horses since childhood, been doing westerns for over 30 years. He knew what he was doing, but there was something deeper at work. McCrea wanted the audience to see him, the real him, not a stand-in. He wanted every moment of Steve Judd's physicality to be authentic because the character's dignity depended on it. A man in his final years, still capable, still strong, still relevant. If McCrea faked it, the illusion would shatter. So he didn't fake anything. He rode hard, fell hard, got back up, and kept going. And when you watch the film, you can feel it. The authenticity, the grit. A real cowboy playing a cowboy, refusing to let age slow him down until the very end. The film's title wasn't always Ride the High Country. When the script first landed on Peckinpah's desk, it was called Guns in the Afternoon, a title the studio loved because it sounded tough and commercial. But Peckinpah hated it. He thought it was generic, forgettable, another disposable Western title that told you nothing about the story's soul. He pushed for Ride the High Country, a title that carried weight and poetry, that spoke to journey's ending and moral high ground. The studio resisted. They ran test screenings with both titles. Focus groups preferred Guns in the Afternoon. More action-oriented, they said, more masculine. But Peckinpah wouldn't back down. He argued that Ride the High Country captured the film's elegiac tone, its meditation on aging and honor. Eventually, the studio compromised in the strangest way possible. They released it as Guns in the Afternoon in the UK and Ride the High Country in the US. Two titles for one film. And decades later, everyone remembers Ride the High Country. Nobody remembers the other one. Sometimes the artist knows better than the marketing department.
After he did The Virginian, that he decided that's all he wanted to do was Western.
Edgar Buchanan, who played the judge, was working through genuine pain during the entire shoot. He'd injured his leg in a fall weeks before filming began, but he never told Peckinpah or the producers. He was afraid they'd replace him, give the role to someone younger and healthier. So he hid the injury, wrapped his leg tight every morning, and limped through his scenes. The limp actually worked for the character, a weary old man tired of frontier justice. But between takes, Buchanan would sit alone, grimacing, waiting for the pain to subside before the next setup. The crew noticed but said nothing. They respected his professionalism, his determination to finish what he'd started. On the final day of shooting, Buchanan finally admitted to Peckinpah that he'd been hurt the whole time. Peckinpah was stunned, then quietly grateful. He told Buchanan that pain had made the performance better, more authentic. And Buchanan just smiled and said, "Well, that's what we're paid for, isn't it? To make suffering look like art." The film's cinematography wasn't supposed to look beautiful. Peckinpah wanted it raw, dusty, almost documentary-like to match the harsh realities of aging and moral compromise. But cinematographer Lucien Ballard had other ideas. He'd been shooting films since the 1930s and knew how to make landscapes sing. Without telling Peckinpah, he started composing shots that captured the high Sierras in all their majestic glory. Golden light filtering through trees, mountains towering in the background, clouds casting shadows across valleys. When Peckinpah saw the dailies, he was initially furious. This wasn't what he'd asked for. But then he watched longer and realized something. The beauty wasn't undermining the story. It was enhancing it. These aging men were riding through paradise one last time, and the gorgeous cinematography made their mortality even more poignant. Heaven exists, and they're leaving it. Peckinpah never apologized for his initial anger, but he gave Ballard free rein for the rest of the shoot. And that decision gave us some of the most breathtaking visuals in Western cinema. Number 14. The script went through massive changes during filming. Peckinpah would rewrite scenes the night before shooting them, sometimes hours before. He'd sit in his trailer with a typewriter and a bottle, reimagining dialogue, cutting speeches down to single lines, finding silence where the script had words. The actors never complained. McCrea and Scott understood that Peckinpah was chasing something, refining the story until it felt true, but it made continuity a nightmare. The script supervisor would show up each morning, not knowing what version of the scene they'd be shooting. Props that were written in one draft would disappear in the next. Entire characters had their motivations changed overnight, and yet somehow, miraculously, it all held together. Because Peckinpah wasn't changing things randomly. He was listening to the film, letting it tell him what it needed to be. And that organic evolution, that willingness to throw out what wasn't working even at the last second, gave Ride the High Country an authenticity that scripted films rarely achieve. Number 15. MGM had no faith in the finished film. When they saw the final cut, they didn't see a masterpiece. They saw a slow, quiet Western with no major stars and no commercial appeal. So they buried it. They gave it a limited release, barely advertised it, treated it like a B-movie filler. It played second billing to bigger, louder films that nobody remembers now. Peckinpah was devastated. He'd poured everything into this film, fought for every frame, and the studio was throwing it away like garbage. But then, something unexpected happened. Critics in Europe saw it and went wild. At film festivals in France and Italy, Ride the High Country was celebrated as a masterwork. Directors like François Truffaut praised it. Audiences demanded it be re-shown. The film won awards overseas that American critics hadn't even nominated it for. And slowly, grudgingly, MGM realized they'd made a mistake. They re-released it in America with a bigger marketing push. And this time, audiences found it. Word spread. The film that was supposed to disappear became a cult classic, then a genuine classic. All because artists in Europe recognized what executives in Hollywood couldn't see. The famous final line, "I'll see you later," almost didn't make it into the film. In the original script, Steve Judd's dying words were a longer speech about honor and duty and living right, but during rehearsal, McCrea told Peckinpah it felt false. A man dying wouldn't make a speech. He'd say something simple, something human. Peckinpah agreed and told McCrea to say whatever felt natural. They did a take, and McCrea, looking up at his friend, simply said, "I'll see you later." 3 words. No philosophy, no grand statement, just a quiet acknowledgement of mortality and friendship. The crew went silent. Even Peckinpah, who rarely showed emotion on set, had to turn away for a moment. They only did one take. They didn't need another. Those 3 words became one of the most powerful endings in Western cinema because they trusted simplicity over spectacle. And decades later, fans still argue about what those words really mean. Is it faith, hope, or just a man trying to comfort his friend? The ambiguity makes it perfect.
You add them all up and I'd think.
Randolph Scott and Joel McCrea became even closer during filming. They'd known each other for years but had never worked together extensively. Now, spending long days on location, riding together, rehearsing together, they formed a bond that went beyond professional respect. Between setups, they'd sit in the shade and talk about their careers, their families, their regrets. Both men knew this was probably their last film, their final statement as actors, and that shared awareness created an intimacy that's visible on screen. When Judd and Westrom talk about the old days, you're watching 2 real friends reflecting on real lives. When they argue about morality and compromise, you're hearing genuine philosophical differences being worked out. And when they ride together in those final scenes, you're watching 2 men saying goodbye, not just as characters, but as actors who knew their time was ending. After filming wrapped, they stayed friends until Scott's death in 1987. And McCrea, who lived until 1990, reportedly said that Ride the High Country was the film he was most proud of. Not because of awards or recognition, but because he got to work with his friend one last time. The mining town set was built specifically for the film, and it nearly bankrupted the production. The budget was already razor thin, and constructing an entire town in the mountains was expensive and logistically complicated. Materials had to be hauled up narrow roads. Workers had to camp on location. Weather delays meant paying crews to sit idle. MGM executives kept calling, demanding Peckinpah find a cheaper solution, use an existing set, scale back the vision. But Peckinpah refused. The town had to feel real, lived in, dangerous. It couldn't look like a Hollywood backlot. So they built it, every building, every false front, every muddy street. And when filming wrapped, the studio wanted to dismantle it immediately to recoup some costs. But Peckinpah convinced them to leave it standing for possible reshoots. They agreed, and the set stayed up for months. Years later, other productions used that same mining town for different films. And in a strange way, Steve Judd's last stand became a recurring location in Western cinema, a ghost town that kept living through other stories. The film's score by George Bassman was almost replaced. MGM wanted something more traditional, more sweeping and heroic, filled with the kind of orchestral bombast that audiences expected from Westerns. But Bassman composed something quieter, more melancholic, with acoustic guitars and mournful strings. The executives heard it and demanded changes. Too sad, they said. Too slow. Where's the excitement? But Peckinpah fought for Bassman's score. He argued that the music needed to reflect the film's themes of aging and loss. This wasn't a triumphant Western, it was a funeral march. The studio eventually relented, but they limited the budget for the score. Bassman had to work with a smaller orchestra, fewer recording sessions, less time to refine. But those limitations worked in the film's favor. The sparse, intimate score perfectly matched the story's quiet dignity. And today, it's considered one of the great Western scores precisely because it didn't sound like everything else. It dared to be sad when convention demanded triumph. After Ride the High Country wrapped, Sam Peckinpah's career completely changed trajectory. The film's critical success gave him credibility, proved he could handle complex themes and work with legendary actors, but it also created expectations he'd spend the rest of his career fighting against. Studios wanted more elegiac westerns, more poetic meditations on aging heroes, but Peckinpah wanted to push boundaries, get more violent, more controversial. His next films, Major Dundee and especially The Wild Bunch, shocked audiences with graphic violence and moral ambiguity. Critics who'd praised Ride the High Country were horrified. They accused Peckinpah of betraying his own talent, of choosing cheap shock over artistry. But Peckinpah knew something they didn't. Ride the High Country was about men whose time had passed. His later films were about men destroying themselves because they couldn't adapt. Same themes, different approach. The violence wasn't betrayal, it was evolution. And in hindsight, you can see the through line. From the quiet dignity of Steve Judd to the explosive chaos of Pike Bishop, Peckinpah was always exploring how codes of honor survive or crumble in changing worlds. Ride the High Country wasn't just his breakthrough, it was his thesis statement. The original ending was completely different and infinitely darker. In the first draft of the script, Steve Judd didn't die from his wounds. He survived the shootout, delivered the gold, but then discovered he'd been set up by the bank. There was no gold. The whole job was a test to see if he was still trustworthy, still useful. And he wasn't. They fired him on the spot. The film was supposed to end with Judd wandering off alone, humiliated, a man who'd done everything right and gained nothing. Peckinpah read that ending and immediately threw it out. He told the writers that cynicism without redemption was just cruelty. Judd had to die, but he had to die having done the right thing. His honor had to mean something, even if the world no longer valued it. That change, that insistence on dignity over despair, transformed the film from a bitter tragedy into something transcendent. Because in the end, Ride the High Country isn't about success or reward. It's about integrity mattering even when nobody's keeping score. And that simple idea, executed perfectly, made it timeless. Ride the High Country didn't just capture the end of the Old West, it captured the end of an era of filmmaking, the end of careers, the end of innocence. Two legends rode off together, a director found his voice, and a tiny budget film became one of the greatest westerns ever made. So go ahead, like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what classic film we should explore next. Thanks for riding along, and remember, sometimes the best endings are the ones that hurt a little, because they mean something.